art in the most fundamental way.
So, the central idea I would like to discuss with you is living machines. I am a living machine, and to me you are also a living machine. But the artifacts we build, like robots, will in future also more and more be based on principles that propel us forward. Okay, so it's really about how do we capture the design principles of biological systems to understand ourselves and to advance technology. Okay. So the work I'm describing is, of course, the result of a collaboration with many different people from many different kinds of backgrounds who are in my research group. So we have mathematicians, physicists, engineers, psychologists, neuroscientists, what have you. And I'm very grateful for all their contributions. So this is multidisciplinary teamwork. Okay, it's team science. And one of the things I would like to get across that also we need a team science that is reaching out to art and vice versa. So the brain, this is your brain. This is the human brain. Human brain, the outer shell you see there is about the size of a pizza. It's a neocortex. And it's all stuffed inside your skull. It's a few millimeters thick. But underneath that are many other structures of the brain. So the brain is a multi-structured, multi-layered system. And already Hippocrates, many years ago, believed that it was really the brain that was the seat of all our experience. Everything we are is our brain. All our experiences are our brain. And actually, Francis Crick, famous from his discovery of the structure of DNA together with Watson, called that the astonishing hypothesis in the book he wrote in the 90s. But so there's just the idea that the brain is the seat of our soul, if you want, the seat of our experience, is an old one. But to make it stick as a science is actually an whole other kind of exercise, and that's the one that we engage in. So the one thing about the brain is that we have to think about what's the brain good for? Why did brains really evolve? And the starting point for us is to say, well, brains evolved to act. Our brains evolved to drive action in the real world. Okay, we can go to slide number 5 there. Yep, great. So that's a starting point. It all turns around action. So like here, these capucine monkeys using rocks as tools to crack nuts, for instance. But why is the brain the controller of action? The argument is actually a really simple one, right? Because if evolution progresses by differential reproduction, right, survival of the fittest, according to Charles Darwin, without action, I can guarantee you there's not much reproduction, okay? So we take very much an action-oriented view on what brains do. But now brains are not completely trivial, right? So our brain weighs about 1.5 kilograms, right? It comprises about 90 billion elements called neurons, and there's an equal amount of non-neural cells, or neuroglia. And these cells are very tiny, so in red you would see, let's say, the input of that cell, the dendrite, to this pyramid. This is a layer 4 pyramidal cell of the cat visual cortex that's reconstructed in 3D. In gray you see the projection out from the cell, from its soma, and every little dot here is what we call a synapse, the connection with another cell, right? And you have about, every neuron will have about 1,000 up to 100,000 of these connections. But every of these synapses in turn is a very complex structure, a very complex molecular machine, right? Of which we have many billions that make up our brain. And it's this complex multi-level system that is the seat of our soul. Now, the other amazing thing about brains that we should think about later a bit is as this monkey is cracking the nuts and its brain is doing its job and all the neurons are firing away, if you do the math, which some people have done, every synaptic action in this brain is about a femtojoule. So that's 10 to the minus 15 joules, a tiny amount of energy. But given this large amount of synapses, you can then calculate what's the total energy consumption of a brain. It's about 20 watts, right? So it's like a small light bulb. And that's actually an astonishing outcome, right? Because we have great difficulties to replicate brains with computers who consume orders of magnitude more energy. So evolution has found a solution to this problem of experience and consciousness and action control that actually is really low power. And in some sense, you can look at this as an alien technology, right? We have no clue how it works, right? We have some beginnings, but there are many mysteries. But it's all happening inside your skull. So, how do we test these? We can have some volume now, if that's possible. How do we test our ideas about how robots work? Well, we take robots, like this iCup robot built by the Italian Institute of Technology in Genova. And this robot will engage with humans in a social way. So we pose questions, what's social cognition? We can say, how can you learn a language? How can I learn to communicate? So let's see what the robot is doing here.
Next time you lose. Got it.
So what we essentially do, we build control structures based on the principles of the brain, as far as we understand them. We use them to control robots that look a bit similar to us. And with that, we can start to think about how do brains control behavior in the real world, how do robots control, or brains control social interaction. And actually, there was a massive breakthrough in the lab not so long ago. So this robot is learning the names of objects. Yeah? So it says, what's this object? It's a bit a postmodern experiment because this is a duck. Okay? Okay, so now knows it's a duck. Yeah? All right. So, but now over many experiences, it can learn things about its body and its fingers and whatever. But then you can have a whole dialogue with this robot about its own autobiographical memory. What does it remember of all these things? And the amazing, so Sock here is interrogating the robot. Why do you do this and why do you do that? Why did you take the octopus, right? And this robot, for the first time ever, any robot declared, I take the octopus because I want octopus. So we had a machine that really wanted something. And of course you can say, well, I can have my computer say hello world. Who would say that the computer knows what the world is? But actually this robot really wanted it. Because this robot has a drive to satisfy human requests. So it really feels happy when it satisfies human requests. That's its want. But it cannot explain it. It cannot say, oh, I took the octopus because I want to satisfy what humans ask me. It has an internal emotional state that it calls, I want something. The reasons remain unknown to the robot and often to ourselves as well. Okay, so this is an example of how we then study the brain. So, but what's this piece of miscellaneous magic between our ideas about the brain? This is another form of anatomical experimentation in the real world, and the robot. Well, that is science, right? We have ideas, we have hypotheses, we have theories. And their science is nothing magic, right? Science means something very concrete. In science, we want to get to third-person, verifiable descriptions of reality. It's very simple. I want to give you a recipe that tells you this is how I understand this phenomenon. And you, by following that recipe, can confirm my story. That makes it third person. It's not first person, it's not experience. It's external, it's externalized as a theory. And scientific theories also have a very concrete meaning because they need to explain, predict, and control. And that's the game of science, that's all we do. Okay? So the rules are clear. In that sense. The objectives are clear, we have clear definitions. So that's what we work with. We have ideas, intuitions, we have hypotheses, and we turn them into theories. And the great thing about theories is that they can be wrong. Because it's in being wrong that you really learn something. So what we're always trying to do, very systematically, is break the theory. Because that's the point where you're going to learn, where you're going to make progress. So that's our mission. How do we explain the psychological properties that we have? This is psyche, as reflected in a mosaic in a Roman villa. How does the brain give rise to these psychological phenomena? How does psyche emerge from flesh? This is our challenge. And we test this by building robots that reflect these psychological properties. But with that, we also express brains are embodied. Brains have physicality. Brains might virtualize the world, we can have dreams, but it's all grounded in this physical interaction with the world. So, brains are the product of evolution. We are the product of evolution, right? We cannot escape from that. And if you look at evolution, of course we have the magic of the Cambrian explosion, where suddenly all body forms we know today emerged, all the body plans emerged, and with their brains, right? This 560 million years ago. So this is sort of the progression of life forms on planet Earth. And it's really important that we think about brains and what brains do and what we do in the context of that evolutionary process. So that's definitely what we're trying to achieve. And one important observation of that is evolution conserves design principles. Our DNA is 50% similar to that of bacteria, because bacteria just found some really great tricks to deal with metabolism and energy management. It was not reinvented again, right? Our brains look very much like the brains of lamprey or hagfish that emerged 360 million years ago. All right, so evolution conserves principles, right? Our brains are very similar to rat brain. The details, there are some details that are different, but from a sort of a broader perspective, we share many features. So, in a discussion on then creativity, we also looked at that from this biological perspective. What are these shared design features of biology that could also help us to understand creativity? So here you see the development of this neuron, not literal, but of a neuron, and how it actually forms that synapse, how one of these little blue dots here gets anchored in your nervous system. And what happens, it's a process of exploration, right? You have acting different filaments that go out in the interaction of microtubules and actin, and they explore the environment. And dependent on the feedback that these processes receive from the environment, they will either establish themselves or they will retract. And that's something else you can see. This is now a reduction of the same process where we only look at the microtubules, the skeleton of a cell, and you see what a dynamic process it is. Some retract and some remain. It's a process of exploration. Okay? And for me, this is already a very foundational expression of what we call creativity. Creativity is not unique to us. Creativity is universal to life. And that's then also how we have pursued it. Here's another example. Here we have the magnetic termites. They're called magnetic because they build these really complex structures that are aligned on the north-south axis. But these structures are built without any designers, without any architects, pure out of the interaction between the termites as a colony and their environment. This actually got damaged, so they had to fix it. But the result is we get structures that actually do resemble very much the kind of biomimetic architecture that Antoni Gaudi was advancing. All right, so we can get to complex structures without an architect, without top-down control, without a master plan. Also, your brain is built without a master plan. It's a self-organizing process. So we've been taking that to heart, and we have then posed the question, okay, to what extent can we really use that to explain and drive also creative artifacts? How far does this go? How do we manipulate this form of self-organizing creativity? So the purpose of this creativity there is to discover the unknown unknowns. You know, the famous Rumsfeld quote, right? Our big problem is, what are the unknown unknowns? We call that, because we're scientists and we want to win in Scrabble, epistemic autonomy. Right? How can my knowledge really be autonomous and my knowledge, and not projected into my brain by God or any external entity? So we call this, together with my friend Jonathan Manzoli, a Brazilian mathematician and composer, situated aesthetics. How does aesthetics emerge out of this self-organization where agents interact with environments, where it does not depend on the genius? Okay? So I give you some examples. In 2002, when I was working at the ETH in Zurich, Um, I built a project called ADA, which was part of the Swiss National Exhibition Expo 2002. And ADA was actually embedded in the body of this whale. There was the whole Pinocchio story built underneath this on this platform. And ADA, where we worked also with Giger, who was a great artist. He was not very popular, but I think he's absolutely fantastic. He helped us very much to express this strong confluence, the symbiosis we are foreseeing between technology and biology, between ourselves and our technology, how we can all become cyborgs, if you want. So here's an example of what ADA does. ADA was an interactive space, 180 square meters, that you could enter. So what you see in ADA is that ADA expresses itself in a language of sound and light. Okay, so it's not anthropomorphic on purpose. And the question was, how can you build effective communication between humans and such a non-anthropomorphic artifact? On top of that, ADA had a brain-like control system, where we thought about, okay, how can the emotions of this artifact be communicated to humans via musical composition? So there was a closed-loop control. ADA was, in that sense, autonomous. Right? It was epistemically autonomous, the way I just described it. But the one thing that we observed is that if you look, for instance, here we have the sound composition. This is like a piano. Here are the piano keyboards, and this is what the keys do over time. The sound compositions that ADA was generating really fooled humans. So actually, there was a production movie made about the whole project, and the sound engineer won a Swiss Oscar for Best Production Sound Movie Soundtrack, because he was the guy who glued our soundtrack to the movie. But the jury had no idea that was completely machine generated. Right? So these are very plausible pieces of music, because what they capitalize on is the dynamics of interaction. Variability in the environment, because humans interact with the system in a certain way, but this variability is not random, it's structured. So the other thing we learned in ADA, because look, we're scientists, right? So you have 500,000 people, that's enormous amounts of data. So we could measure the hell out of this thing. Every visitor we could measure. We could question them, we could measure their behavior, we could look what they do. And what did we observe? If we look at their distributions in space and their movements, actually people who were active, who really moved about in the space, had a much deeper experience about the whole event and a better understanding of how the device was working than those that were just passive observers. And this then became very much a driving hypothesis of a number of things that followed that I will describe to you. Okay, so this was a very fundamental insight of this art project. We did lots of things, but what we learned here, which we then brought back to the science, is apparently action really shapes experience in a very profound way. This was the synthetic oracle, which was a further variation of in Zurich, 2005. I like the idea of an oracle. We want to know the future. You could move about in this space with these lighting pillars. And these were the very first production LEDs that were available at the time. Pose your questions by moving, and the system would respond to you in sound and light. Okay? This was very effective, also for kids, but also for humans, for adults. It was a very sort of meditative space. Indeed, sometimes kids appear different species, but that would be not proper to advocate. So the next experiment, I want to look more at the causality of interaction. This is called repercussion. So this avatar was huge, this giant, dancing in very elegant fashion. But of course you might think, well, the graphics look pretty old. Yes, they are, but that's not the point. What we're changing here is the causality of the performance. Because everything is instrumented. The whole stage is like a big robot that knows exactly what the dancer is doing. And the whole content of the performance is driven now by the dancer. So we change the causality of the performance. It's not the dancer following some score, it is the dancer generating the score, okay? And that also means, of course, that every performance is uniquely different because there is always small variations in what the performers do. Also, Verbier helped us understand better to deal with questions of interactive storytelling. Right? I see the brain as a big storytelling machine. We tell ourselves stories about the world, but how do we understand the structure of these stories? And Verbier was an experiment that allows us in a very controlled way investigate that question of interactive storytelling. This is the world's first chamber orchestra that plays its music, its instruments, without their hands, but only with brain activity. So I heard some emotional reactions to the content. That was exactly the point. Because the lady you see here is our emotional conductor. And she's wearing a head-mounted display. And she's watching this movie. And this movie was built like an emotional narrative. There was no logic to it, but it was supposed to have very much sort of emotion driving or emotive content. And it was her physiological response to these emotions that you can see here. You see her heart rate and her galvanic skin response that would in real time drive the emotional connotation of the musical composition. Like how do you balance, let's say, your consonance and dissonance in your expression or your choice of timbre in a multi-voice composition. And it's then within that dynamically evolving musical composition that the chamber orchestra is injecting its discrete events. So again here we're playing with this notion of what's the causality of the performance and also what is the channel of expression. Do we really need to train ourselves first to master musical instruments before we can express ourselves in a creative way? So with these experiments in hand, or having performed them, we had a notion of certain principles. Principles of expression, of experience, and knowledge that we then thought we could bring back to the lab and the real world. So that's then what happened. And the central underlying idea became this idea of information foraging. Right? How do we search information? How do we search actively for experience, because we saw across these different artistic experiments that seemed to be a core driver of the experience that we were instilling. And one concept there became that maybe human memory, and actually this is also work that we did together in collaboration with Edward Moser, who got the Nobel Prize in 2014 for his work on the memory of the rat, of mammalians in the hippocampus. And we explained some of his data by showing that physical action in space has about a 30% modulation of memory. So the depth of memory gets enhanced by about 30% if you're actively engaging with the content. So with a lot of science around that, but now we try to translate that to the real world in different applications. First, we built the experience induction machine. It's a device where we can link humans, fully instrumented or not, to content generation. I can measure your brain states, your heart state, I can measure what you look at, and dependent on that, I can generate content. So that means I could sort of generate your dreams as long as I can have access to the proper set of states of your body. Also, the experience induction machine allows to bring people together virtually and physically in a mixed reality environment. Second thing we did is, okay, if we believe that action boosts memory, let's test it. So this is the brain of one of our epilepsy patients that we worked on. This is the brain cube system. Here you see this human in action. So they're navigating a virtual world. And dependent on the locations where they are, they have to memorize a certain item. So you see, we now made this whole idea about action modulating memory very measurable. And we measure from different points in their brain, because epilepsy patients have electrodes implanted in their heads. And here you see these responses of their brain in real time as they go through this environment. So we analyze this kind of stuff. And what we're after, what we're starting to show now, but this is work in progress, is that you really see if you are in an active mode, you see very global coupling in the brain. You see different brain systems really linking together in a very distinct way that is absent if you're very passive. So actually for museum directors, it's important to keep in mind, when you design exhibitions, if you make your visitor passive observers, you only address a small part of what you could address in their brain. Anyway, so that's another one translation of the ideas. Build the science, bring it back to the science. The other one is education. So here we have an augmented or virtual reality tablet application that we built for the Bergen-Belsen Memorial in Germany. Because as you can see, there's nothing there. The space tells you nothing about this history, and I think that's a problem. Because first, across Europe, there are 42,000 sites where the Holocaust and Nazi crimes were committed in some form. Most of these sites look like Bergen-Belsen. There's nothing there, okay? And they disappear. And the tragedy on top of that is the only survey ever done on the impact of Holocaust education in the UK 2 years ago showed that high school kids who had gotten this education for many years had no idea what the Holocaust really meant. So our whole educational programs in this domain have failed, and we got to change it. So what we're doing, we want to bring information together with space, recapture the historical space, and use virtual reality, augmented reality, and active engagement to allow people to explore the history of that site. But we do this in a very distinct way. It's not just about recreating what was there physically. We use the physical space only as the gateway into the historical information. So you can see it here, like you go around, and you get now access to distinct historical sources. And this exactly fits my model that I just described to you, because I told you we found out explicitly action modulates memory with 30%. So I want people to study that history as they are active, because I will know their memory will be much more profound. So here you see how it's used on site by German students. The program is booked out for at least a year in advance, so it has been very effective. And we're now generalizing it to different sites across Europe, from Norway to Croatia. And also we have a permanent installation. This one was on display 2015 at the Wiener Library in London. where we again use the same principle, active engagement with content. However, now you don't walk around physically, but you move about virtually, right? And it's equally effective if you test people's memory, right? So you can move through the site, you can look at different historical periods, and you can engage with that historical content. We also just displayed this at Westerbork Memorial in the Netherlands. We also have actually by now followed the same procedure for the Westerbork Memorial. But you see here, we've changed the paradigm. Because what you also see is we're not giving people a comprehensive narrative of what the history is. We give them fragments of that history, so that in that sense we trigger their questions that they can pursue. Right? So we don't give them a linear, normative, singular description of what history meant. We make it more an exploration, right? In that sense, again, obeying this notion of epistemic autonomy. I don't tell you what to think. I want you to figure it out on your own. But I give you the tools so you can do it. Then we've also mapped this. I want to replace all school teachers with robots, and school teachers should become coaches of kids. Okay? So we've done this over a number of experiments to individualize education. So we're rolling that out right now in Barcelona. We have been doing many big experiments also in the Netherlands and the UK. And the last application domain where we have had some traction is in stroke rehabilitation. Our lifetime risk of stroke is 18%. That's a high number. It will be modulated by lifestyle. But of the 60 million chronic stroke patients in the world, they basically receive no treatment because effectively we don't know what to do. So we again took these same principles that we had explored across our different art experiments to try to see whether we could have an impact on stroke rehabilitation. This is the response of the brain of a stroke patient in our simulation environment. This is a right precentral gyrus stroke, so it sits about here. And you know there are many deficits. This is what it might look like post-mortem. It can be really devastating lesions to the brain, but brains are very adaptive and very plastic. We just have to feed them in the right way. And that's the thing that we didn't figure out yet until now. So we built a rehabilitation gaming system where we allow this brain as a simulator to re-engage with the world in an embodied virtual way. And by now we have treated over 1,000 patients, and we have shown that this is the most effective thing you can do compared to anything else out there in the world. But again, you see here, the driver is embodied active engagement with the world, obeying ecological principles of embodiment. So this is one of our patients with preeclampsia. This is women who are pregnant, suffer from really high blood pressure sometimes, and that can induce strokes. So she's been one of our patients who was featured on Euronews. Okay, so you see, we had ideas, we had hypotheses, we had theory. We expanded those through these different art projects because you can push really at the fringes of where you are. But then again, we took our observations to heart and turned them into science, right? To really consolidate these insights that the artistic projects gave us. So what's the future? What's next? So what's our mission now? Well, I think that working with robots, modeling ourselves as robots, has very clearly shown us that we are not an Industriepalast, as Fritz Kahn would have it. We're not mechanical and deterministic in that sense, right? We are complex, multi-scale systems that are engaging with, again, a multi-scale environment, driven by principles of self-organization and creativity. Building robots to study ourselves have made that now very clear. So, using robots to study ourselves has not made us robots. I think it has made us more human. And what we have to realize is that we have entered now the Anthropocene. As you know, the first signature that humans became the dominant force also at the geological scale was when we spread plutonium all over this planet, when we did the first nuclear tests in 1945. So this is an ice core from Greenland, and if you analyze these ice cores, you will see at the top a very distinct change. Suddenly plastics appear, and pesticides, and fly ash, products of our activities, right? So that's why we now believe humans are the dominant force also at the geological scale. So if you want, we are now the drivers. We are driving the state of this planet. And of course, global warming is a typical example of that. So we are it now, right? This is what we sent out on Pioneer a long time ago. But we are it. We dominate this planet, for better and for worse. And I think this raises important questions, right? So is it the robots that will take over? Is it the robot AI will kill us all? I don't think so. The biggest, the robots will not kill us, but this might still be the last century of life as we know it, as some people have predicted, because the biggest enemy of humans are humans. We are the problem. And so what I'm advocating is that it is really essential that first we stop business as usual, because there's some urgency, and wherever you look, things don't work. Okay? And we are the problem. As long as we don't understand ourselves, we will not have grip on that problem. So there's an urgent need that we really understand who we are, for better and for worse. If you want concrete goals, okay, let's go to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and my ambition is that we build a science and technology to advance on those goals. That we advance on these goals of poverty, hunger, empowerment, and what have you. But I believe that underlying those goals are a number of other problems we face we should not close our eyes for. We face a massive technological crisis. Okay? To build an Airbus A380 is about at the limits of what we can achieve with respect to integration. We have massive integration issues. You saw earlier how massively integrated brains are. An Airbus is not even 1% of that. We don't know how to scale, right? We also don't know how to scale in terms of energetic needs, but the other point is, and that's maybe more important, as you're sitting on your phone, in a few decades, we won't have iPhones anymore, because we're running out of the materials to build them. We use many rare earth elements to build these technologies, and they are finite. Okay, so we'll run out of the materials to build the technology that we know. So chips as we know it, processors as we know it, cannot be realized anymore 20, 30, 40 years from now, by the time the Anthropocene really hits its big crisis. Okay, so we got to work on that. So what are we after? We are now pushing a project called Sapiens 5.0. Basically means, look, the first phase of Sapiens was hunter-gatherers, right? It's about 70 to 80,000 years ago. Then we discovered agriculture with all its side effects that were rather negative, followed by the age of industrialization, labor, control. And about 1980s, this was taken over by the information age. And now we reach the end of that, because now we are looking into, if you want, the abyss of the finite nature of our current society and our current culture. And I believe that it is really essential that we build a science, an art, and a technology that helps us to progress into this next era of our existence, which is Sapiens 5.0. And in doing that, you know, everything is easy for the person who doesn't have to do it. I can tell you, to build these installations, to build these technologies, it's not just a conversation over a glass of beer or a paper that you write, right? So ADA is 50 man-years of work. To develop this stroke rehabilitation system is about 30 man-years of work, okay? That spans over 15 years. So these are all processes that take time. We don't do that in a day. So that's why we got to start on time, because everything is easy for the person who doesn't have to do it. So I believe in eudaimonia with machines. Our friends, the Greek philosophers, saw it as their mission to understand virtue and the good life. Right? So this was their fundamental question, not logic or mathematics. It was, how can we live a virtuous life? And I think our challenge is, how can we indeed build a virtuous life, a sustainable, dignified human society, also with the help of machines? Because machines are also there to help us and to overcome our limitations and our failures. So I believe underlying the Sustainable Development Goals are just a few dimensions. I think health, education, and identity, like historical identity, are some of these main dimensions, and you see we have been exploring those. Coupling scientific activity and art. Because science can help us to know. You can ask me, how do you know that? And I can give you an argument about consistency, about an empirical base, empirical anchoring of what we know. But art, as I also illustrated to you with the projects we have done, helps us to explore beyond what we know, right? To think outside of that box. And that's why we need both, in a very tight collaboration, where if you want, science can give structure and rationality to an artistic search, while artistic search gives freedom to the scientific method. So that's the model that we are pursuing in the service of humanity. This is the model of living machines, because I'm a living machine, you're a living machine, and as living machines who hopefully will help us to understand and improve the human condition. Thank you very much.